All right, welcome back. And in case you're new to this video, you should know that this is the second video in a series on the Ukrainian crisis of 2022. So it would behoove you to go back and check out the first video if you have not watched it. But let's move on. So in this video, we're going to be focusing on modern Ukraine. And we're going to leave Russia and the West largely to the side in this, although because it's Ukraine, they're going to come into the picture from time to time. So let's begin by taking a look at a population density map of Ukraine. As you can see, Ukraine has a very unevenly divided population. It really has three major population centers. Kiev, which is the largest city. Then you have a fairly urbanized and a sort of cluster of small cities in the east near Donetsk and Luhansk. And then you have the area around the Carpathian Mountains, which we've been referring to as Galicia, around the city of Lviv. And in between those areas, there is not much. It is very sparsely populated and a lot of empty agricultural land. So it's for the purposes of our discussion, we're going to divide Ukraine into three different areas. One is Galicia, which is the westernmost area marked in blue. There is the Wild Fields, which is the area in the southeast marked in red. And then there's the Kyiv, or the capital area, which is marked in yellow in the northern central portion. And to any Ukrainian listeners who come across this video, I am very sorry for picking names that are probably offensive in one way or another. I just particularly like the name Galicia and the Wild Fields as far as being very evocative of how the differences in these regions lead to the political dynamic within Ukraine. Galicia, what does Galicia want to do generally in modern Ukraine? They want to integrate closely with the West. Specifically, they want to integrate closely with Poland, Slovakia, the neighbors around them. What does the Wild Fields want to do? They want to be part of Russia. They want to, well, maybe not part of Russia, but they certainly want to be in greater communication, in greater association with Russia, similar to how Belarus is. Now, the yellow region, Kyiv, what does Kyiv want? They are the capital city, and they, as a result of being the capital city, they want to hold the country together. And a quick note about capital cities in general. Modern nation states are run by a professional managerial class, which tend to cluster around the capital city of a nation state. Think of bureaucrats, lawyers, those types. Over time, the longer a country has been around, the larger the clustering of the PMC around the capital gets. Bigger and bigger, and they dominate more and more of the culture of the capital area, the capital region. Eventually, the goals of the locality around the capital city end up reflecting the goals of the nation's professional managerial class. And the goals, what are the goals of the capital region, of the PMC? They are always, always, always to centralize power more and more to the capital region. To many of you, I'm sure that this is not a terribly shocking revelation. Capital cities derive most of their wealth, most of their power, most of their influence from managing and collecting wealth from the rest of the country. So the larger the country is, the more control they have over the country as a whole, the better off the capital city, and as a result, the PMC within the capital city will be. Other regions in a country, in any given country, may have wildly varying goals, but The region around an established capital city almost always has this outlook. And so keep that in mind as we move forward. Just as an aside, there's actually a secret fourth region marked in purple on this map of Ukraine, which is, of course, Crimea, which has its own culture and history, sort of separate from the rest of Ukraine. But because of the current limbo status of Crimea, they're not really going to come into the picture of the picture much, so we won't discuss them too much in this video. So politics in Ukraine, since their independence from the USSR, has revolved around a few issues, the most notable being the relationship of Ukraine with either Russia or the European Union. And a perfect example of this is this man right here, Leonid Kuchma, who was the president of Ukraine from 1994 to 2004. He began life as a pro-Russian candidate. And in 1994, you can see the election. The areas that are pro-Russian are very pro-Leonid Kuchma. And the areas that are anti-Russian and more Western, pro-Western, are much more towards his opponent. But as it turns out, in the course of his first term, he was plagued with a bunch of corruption scandals, and it hit his reputation in his core areas of southeastern Ukraine. And so what did he do? Well, he had to get support from somewhere, so he decided to switch sides. Instead of getting money and help from Russia in exchange for pro-Russian policies, he switched sides and got money and help from the EU and the US. And so in the next election that he had in 1999, wouldn't you know it, now Western Ukraine is pro-Leonid Kuchma. And although not quite as stark as before, southeastern Ukraine, the areas that were pro-Kuchma are now anti-Kuchma. Well, as it turned out, even after his second election, he won his second election and began his second term as president. He got involved with even more corruption scandals and ended up in as being quite an unpopular president, no matter what. So what did he do? He tried to switch sides back to Russia again. Sadly, by this point in time, all his credibility was used up, and as a result, he had to leave in disgrace for the 2004 election. And in 2004, Kuchma left office, and Ukraine's presidential election became a battle between the two victors. That's Viktor Yushchenko on the left and Viktor Yanukovych on the right. Yushchenko is pro-Europe, Yanukovych is pro-Russian. This was an important election, and this was an important election because it got a little wild. In the runoff election, Yanukovych won in a narrow victory. However, in the process, accusations of electoral fraud were made. Western Ukraine was absolutely furious, and spurred on by some support from the EU, they took to the streets in Western Ukraine, and they began what is now known as the Orange Revolution. It got quite violent. A number of government buildings were occupied. And in the end, the Supreme Court of Ukraine announced that the runoff election was invalid and that they would conduct a second election. And in this election, many European observers were brought in to oversee the election, which, of course, the Russian part of the country saw as basically the European powers fixing the election in favor of Yushchenko. Whether that's true or not, that's not for me to say. I don't know the answer. All I do know is that in the second runoff, Yushchenko won. Now, in Russia, this revolution, the Orange Revolution, as well as the Georgian Rose Revolution in 2003, are examples of what they call color revolutions, which is a backhanded word to describe what Russians see as Western powers coming in and exerting undue influence to take control of the country and swing that country more to Western influence. So that gives you sort of an idea of the state of Russian politics.
Hola, me dic Ares, soc de la Val d'Aran, el meu nom és típic de la Val d'Aran. Jo naixi en Viella, en Espitau, m'agrada molt la Val d'Aran perquè són poblacions molt petites i tot i mos portam bastantment entre nosaltres en molt massa d'amb tot.
Now what you just heard in that video is the Occitan language. If you have never heard of the Occitan language before, I can't blame you. I just learned about it a couple years ago myself. But this was the language that once was spoken over almost all of southern France. However, during the late Ancien regime in France, the Occitan language began to be suppressed in favor of the French language. And this was really ramped up after the French Revolution. This new French Republic in Paris, based out of Paris, of course, felt the need to forge a nation, a unified nation out of France. And a big portion of that was standardization of the language, and the belief that all French people should speak French. And so, even though the First Republic did not last, the program of language centralization continued naturally and artificially to this day, such that the main strongholds of the Occitan language that actually still remain aren't even really in France. In fact, that video that I showed you was from a speaker in a tiny, tiny little portion of Spain that still speaks Occitan. So similar processes have happened in nearly every European nation, and Ukraine is no different. As a result, language is one of the primary political issues in the country of Ukraine. So the Ukrainian language it has a complicated history. It was originally known as Ruthenian and was spoken in the Rus part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What we in this video call Galicia, all the way and extending close to and overlapping Kyiv. However, as we know, Galicia did not join Ukraine proper until World War II began. And so, after the nation of Ukraine was created after World War I, the area around Kyiv began promoting Ruthenian, or what they now called Ukrainian, as what would be the national language to distinguish themselves from Russia. Remember, Kyiv, as the capital city, is constantly trying to build a coherent nation state out of the territory under their control. And one of the primary ways of doing that is language. And so this program of promoting the now Ukrainian language initially flourished. However, beginning in 1930, actually around the time Galicia joined Ukraine, the Ukrainian language was suppressed by the Soviet Union as an example of bourgeois nationalism. This suppression maintained itself for about 50 years, and then finally, as the Soviet Union entered sort of a declining phase in the 1980s, the Ukrainian language movement, mostly based out of Galicia and Kyiv, began, rising again and being promoted again by the local Soviet government. And then once Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian language became the official language of Ukraine, and Kyiv started to promote the language in many ways. For example, in 2004, Kyiv mandated that all broadcasts use the Ukrainian language and not Russian. This was warmly received by Western Ukraine, obviously, who, speaks Ukrainian and was happy to just continue speaking Ukrainian. However, the wild fields, the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, was not so thrilled. And the 30-year campaign of promoting the Ukrainian language can actually be physically seen on a language map of Ukraine. If you look at this, you can literally see the wild fields as the area that is sort of an overlap between the Russian language, which is green, and the Ukrainian language, which is yellow. Now, you may be wondering to yourself, why is that little part of Western Moldova so solid green? Why on earth do they speak Russian over there? And the answer is that is the pseudo-state of Transnistria, which is a small sliver of Russian-speaking people on the west side of the Dniester River. And they were never subject to the promotion of the Ukrainian language that the rest of the wild fields were. And so you can physically see from the Russian border to Transnistria, the Ukrainian language is slowly eroding the Russian language in the wild fields, which the people in the wild fields are none too thrilled about. Without the propaganda, a proper ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine probably looks like this, with the Russian-speaking people in southern Ukraine, in the wild fields, and the Ukrainian-speaking people in Kyiv and Galicia. It is worth noting that in preparing for this video, I stumbled across a pronunciation video from a woman living in Lviv. And I'll put a link in the description. But at one point, when discussing Kharkiv, which is in eastern Ukraine and is in the wild fields, she makes a very strong point that there is a Russian way of pronouncing it. And she says, that's not the legal way. So, this issue of language and pronunciation is actually a very touchy subject among Ukrainians. Now, Ukraine is also starkly divided on religion into three groups. In Galicia, the majority of the population is part of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which split from Orthodoxy in 1590 to be in communion with the Roman Catholic Church. This was during the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth era. And then in the wild fields and in Kyiv, you have Russian Orthodox people. It is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church initially under the Moscow Patriarchy. However, the split between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church has been developing since independence. It is a very political issue. For example, in 1992, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church split from the Russian Orthodox Church under a new Kyiv Patriarchy. This creation of a new church was an attempt to distinguish a separate Kyiv-focused Orthodox church, separate and distinct from Russia. And then this split in the church has continued to develop. Then in 2008, after the crisis that we'll talk about later, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church merged with an additional portion of the Ukrainian Church under the Moscow Patriarchy to form the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is the cross in the center of this picture. And then you have the wild fields, which is still largely Ukrainian Orthodox under the Moscow Patriarchy. And then here you can see, this is the map of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine's parishes in Ukraine. And unsurprisingly, they are very focused into the area around Kyiv and also a little bit in Western Ukraine. The last factor that we're going to discuss, and I'll just touch briefly on it, is when talking about Ukrainian politics, you just have to be aware that corruption is everywhere. And it comes from at least three vectors. You have corruption that comes from the West, from Europe and the United States, paying off NGOs and politicians that they support and that are pro-Western. And then, of course, you have corruption from Russia, which supports candidates that support Russia and which do some extraordinarily shady things as well, like poisoning their political opponents, which it's just wild. It's just wild. And then you have the third is corruption from the oligarchs, the big businessmen who run the country. Most notably, and this is what this map is showing, oligarchs in control of gas pipelines and coal mining, which are two big industries in Ukraine. You see, Russia is a huge natural gas producer. Europe needs, I think Europe gets 70% of its natural gas from Russia, and that gas has to get to Europe somehow. And so there are a ton of pipelines that pass through Ukraine that deliver this gas to Europe. And it is incredibly important for the Ukrainian economy that they control these gas pipelines because they can make money off of it. And they do. And the corruption around these pipelines is pretty amazing. You could spend an entire hour probably just listing all the various corruption scandals that have happened based on the gas pipelines. Moving on, we'll just touch on a couple minor points, which is the demographics of the country, which is it's not great. Much of the Russian world is declining in population, but you can see in Ukraine there's actually a split, as there is in everything, between Galicia and Kyiv, which are actively growing in population, and then the rest of the country, which is rapidly declining. And this is important because in a democracy, it's going to make the West more and more and more powerful and in control of the country as time passes. And the last thing I want to touch on, this is a image showing the major exports of Ukraine. And you'll notice between corn, iron, more iron, seed oils, wire, there is nothing in this that is not basically a commodity. There is no large products or large technical industries in Ukraine that have taken off. Ukraine is a very, very basic and therefore a very poor economy. It's also worth pointing out that the current debt of the Ukrainian government is fairly high, around 60% of GDP. And that wouldn't be so bad, except you can see that their economy it's very poor, and their economy doesn't grow. It's actually very unreliable whether it's going to grow or shrink from year to year. So the financial situation of the country is not good. So let's begin our discussion of the last crisis with actually a little quick rewind to 2010. In 2010, Viktor Yushchenko had become deeply unpopular due to corruption. No shock. And so in the next election, Viktor Yanukovych was actually elected as a pro-Russian president in another very starkly divided, predictable East-West election. However, Yanukovych, while he was openly pro-Russian, he also promised that he would liberalize trade with Europe as long as it didn't hurt trade relations with Russia. You can guess how this went behind closed doors. So he talked a big game about opening up to Europe, but he had no real desire to do so because his bread was all buttered from Russia. So in 2013, Yanukovych refused to sign an association agreement with the EU that would have put Ukraine on a path of liberalizing trade relations and perhaps other sorts of relations with the EU. Western Ukraine was not happy that he refused to sign this after years of promising that he would. And that sparked, much like the Orange Revolution, huge protests across Kyiv and Western Ukraine. This was known as the Euromaidan movement. And you can see a picture of right here. All the areas in red are the areas where major occupations of government offices occurred. As you can see, the wild fields not very much affected. After Yanukovych tried to quell the protests, ultimately it became violent. People were killed, and in the backlash from that, Yanukovych resigned in disgrace and allowed new elections to occur, which led to the election of Peter Poroshenko. Now, this new government that is taking over was almost entirely Western-leaning and gave little or no representation to the Eastern Russian half of the country. And, for example, their first action was to repeal a law that was in place recognizing Russian as an official regional language in the eastern oblasts of Ukraine. And also, during this time in Russia, played up comments that Viktor Yushchenko had made some years ago, talking about how Ukraine may not renew a lease agreement for the Russian naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea if Russia would not basically stop supporting people who didn't like Viktor Yushchenko. So Russia's reaction to this was to accuse the West, specifically the United States, of inciting the Euromaidan protests, and to say that it was another example of a color revolution, the West trying to stick its nose into internal Russian-Ukrainian relations, and that they needed to back off. And so you can see after the elections and after the initial actions of the new parliament, uprisings began in the wild fields and were largely supported by Russia. Additionally, the whole of Crimea was seized by the Russian military and was annexed back into Russia. This was probably due to the naval base, but we'll talk about that in a later date. Now, what was happening in Donetsk and Luhansk was more than just simple occupying of government offices or intense protests. It was actually an armed insurgency that began around those two cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, fully supported and probably armed and probably trained by the Russian military. And you can see this insurgency goes on to this day. It's called the War in the Donbass, which we will talk more about. But this is the theoretical borders, the ceasefire borders that were established in 2014 by the Minsk Protocol to give some autonomy to Donetsk and Luhansk from Ukraine. Since that 2014 crisis, Ukraine under Poroshenko, who is extremely pro-Western, has predictably been plagued by coalition infighting and also by corruption, which is, it's hardly surprising for Ukraine. And so in 2019, in the runoff election for president, he only received 25% of the vote. And it ended up being a landslide victory for this man, Volodymyr Zelensky, who is an actor, actually, who is famous for playing the president of Ukraine on a relatively famous Ukrainian television show. And here is a map of the 2019 election. And I do not know much about the details of this election, but I do know that this map looks almost absurd in that it doesn't look like any other Ukrainian election. The East-West divide is gone, and now it's literally just Galicia, even not even the entirety of Galicia, just a little tiny bit of Galicia, specifically around Lviv, that is pro-Poroshenko, and the rest of Ukraine just loves Volodymyr Zelensky. And I don't know what that means. Maybe he's just such a great guy and such a popular guy that this happened. But it just seems like a very strange election map in the view of the rest of Ukrainian elections. And I will say, one of the things that I do like about Zelensky is that he has his party, the Servant of the People, has almost a absurdly centrist platform. For example, they cover the language issue, and their stance on the language issue is that the Ukrainian language should be promoted throughout the country, but only quite mildly and through equality. I don't know what that means exactly, but it sounds as milquetoast as you can get. This leads us to the current crisis. So I'll just walk you through the timeline of this current crisis. So in March of 2021, NATO held the largest military exercise in decades called Defender Europe 21, with operations all over Eastern Europe, specifically Estonia on the Russian border, Bulgaria, not on the Russian border, but close to it, and Romania, which is on the border of Ukraine. And in the same month, Zelensky signs a decree calling for the deoccupation of Crimea by Russia. And Ukraine reports to the world, specifically to the U.S., that the Russians are building up their military presence on the Ukrainian-Russian border. So over the spring and summer of 2021, the violence in the Donbass region, that's Luhansk and Donetsk, escalates. There's deaths. There's new weapons that are deployed by the Ukrainian military. There's support given from Russia to the dissidents in Luhansk and Donetsk. And Russia, at the same time, Russia and Belarus conduct an exercise called Zapad 2021 in Belarus, which is right on the Ukrainian border, simulating a battle against NATO. So at the end of that exercise, in late September of 2021, the U.S. announces that Russia has not withdrawn troops from the border of Ukraine. And in December 2021, the U.S. president threatened Russia with sanctions if they did not withdraw their troops from the border. Also around this time, U.S. intelligence announced that Russia was planning an invasion in January of 2022. And actually around that time, a map of the allegedly planned invasion of Ukraine was leaked to the press. And so here it is right here. Who knows how credible this is? Obviously, at the time of this recording, January 2022 has come and gone, and Ukraine has not been invaded. But this could still happen. So in January, Russia and the United States and several other smaller countries evacuated their embassies from Ukraine. Also, Russia transferred a flotilla of ships from the Baltic Sea around Europe and into the Black Sea in preparation for a naval exercise, which at the time of this recording is actually happening right now. And it's notable because several of the ships in this flotilla were actually landing ships capable of amphibiously delivering troops to an area, which, they might do to Odessa. And then also occurring at the time of this recording is Russia is deploying soldiers to Belarus to conduct another joint exercise. And so in literally this week, the United States announced that the invasion of Ukraine is imminent, predicting that Russia would invade Ukraine no later than February 20th, which we will find out. It's going to be it's going to change my video quite a bit if that happens by the time the next video is out. Russia, in response to this, just insists no invasion is planned, and they're accusing the U.S. of unnecessarily stoking tensions between Ukraine, between Europe, between Russia. So I came across this. This is an alleged map of the disposition of Russian military forces around Ukraine. I honestly do not know how reliable or accurate this is, but this is what the press is reporting. How reliable is it? Who can say? The only people who could verify whether this is true or not is actually the Russian military. And that brings us to date on the conflict. And in the next video, we'll look at this crisis from the Russian perspective. We'll look at it from the Western perspective. And then I'll conclude this series with some of my own personal thoughts on what I think will happen, what should happen from the perspective of the West or from the perspective of Ukraine. And we'll wrap this up. Thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you next time.